fighting them, screaming. Nora Aldridge would not go quietly. The man who would marry her was already riding down the ridge, and he was not the quiet rancher most of Redstone Crossing thought they knew. He had been gone since dawn, 12 miles north and back to collect his mother's ring, something he had not told Nora about because it was supposed to be a surprise. He came over the rise above Redstone Crossing at 9:30 on the 3rd of October, 1882, with the ring in his coat pocket and the whole town standing frozen in the road below him. And then he saw the 4 men and the badge behind them, and Nora in her white dress being dragged off the chapel steps by both arms. He stopped his horse completely. He sat there for one long moment, looking at the positions. 4 men from the Crescent V outfit. The town sheriff standing back with a paper in his hand. Nora still fighting, bracing her feet against the stone, buying herself inches she couldn't keep. The preacher on the threshold of the chapel door, doing nothing. And then one of those 4 men, standing near the wagon with the reins in his hands, looked up toward the ridge. His face went the color of old ash, because he knew that flat-brimmed hat. He had seen it once before, 3 years ago, in a different territory, on the worst morning of his life, and the man wearing it had looked at him and said, "You don't have to die for someone else's money. Walk away." Nobody else in the valley knew what that man was. They were about to find out. This is the story of Caleb Doss, and of a forged water rights lien, and of a wedding morning in New Mexico territory that the town of Redstone Crossing remembered for the rest of its years. Subscribe before we're done, partner. And when this story ends, leave me one thing you carried quietly for a long time before anyone figured out you were carrying it. Now let's go back to where it started. Redstone Crossing sat at the southern edge of the Pecos Basin in New Mexico territory, in a shallow valley where 3 artesian draws came out of the Mesa country and fed into the river's eastern fork. It was not a large town, maybe 35 families by 1882, 2 streets, a general store, a livery, a chapel, a courthouse the size of a generous barn, and the particular atmosphere of a place that has found its pace and is not especially interested in being disturbed. The land around it was good land, better than it looked, which was always the most dangerous kind. The artesian draws made the difference. 3 year-round water sources threading through the western quarter of the valley, feeding every farm and ranch within 12 miles. Whoever held the water rights for those 3 draws held a quiet authority over the whole basin, not by law exactly, but by geography. And geography in the dry country of New Mexico territory was more powerful than any law ever written. For 18 years, those rights had belonged to Silas Aldridge. Silas had come to the valley in 1864 with a wife, a wagon, and a water rights survey he had paid a proper land agent to record at the territorial office in Santa Fe. He was a methodical man, a sheep man, the kind who did not make enemies because he did not have enough vanity to be worth making enemies with. He ran a clean operation. He kept good records. He turned his draw water into a hay crop in summer and a wool clip in spring, and he was fair with the other ranchers in the valley about seasonal water access, and the valley was fair back to him, and for nearly 2 decades that arrangement held. Silas's wife had died in 1870, one of fever, leaving him with a 6-year-old daughter named Nora. Nora Aldridge grew up on that hay ranch the way children do when there is work to be done and not enough people to do it, early and capable, and with opinions about things that other people's daughters weren't supposed to have opinions about. She could read a water rights survey as well as her father. She could shear a sheep in under 7 minutes by the time she was 14. She could also bake bread and mend a collar and run figures in her head faster than most men could on paper. And she was beautiful in the particular way of women who never quite figured out that they were, because they were always too busy to stop and look. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's cheekbones. She was 22 years old in the autumn of 1882, and she was, by the honest assessment of everyone who had watched her grow up, a woman it was going to take a certain kind of man to keep up with. Caleb Doss arrived in the valley in August of 1880. He came from the north, which he confirmed, from somewhere more specific that he declined to name, with 2 horses, a bedroll, a carpenter's toolbox, and a quiet manner so thorough and consistent that it stopped being noteworthy after about a week and simply became part of the texture of the place. He bought a 20-acre holding on the valley's eastern edge, a rough, dry piece with a collapsed barn and thin soil, not the kind of holding any serious rancher would choose, but exactly the kind of holding a man with some savings and a desire to disappear into ordinary life might pick precisely because it asked nothing spectacular of him. He fixed the barn. He graded a small vegetable plot. He added a water trough and a second horse paddock, and a root cellar cut into the north-facing hillside. He did these things carefully and without rushing and without asking for any particular attention, and in the way of frontier towns that watch new arrivals, the way the ground watches weather, Redstone Crossing quietly concluded that Caleb Doss was a fair carpenter, a willing neighbor, and a man with nothing particularly interesting going on. He met Nora Aldridge in October of 1880, 2 months after he arrived, at the Redstone Crossing Mercantile and General Store. They were both reaching for the last bag of rolled oats on the 3rd shelf, and their hands arrived at approximately the same moment, and they both stopped and looked at each other. She had gotten there first. He stepped back without making a thing of it. She split the bag with him without being asked. They talked while Hector Beaumont, the Mercantile's owner, divided the oats into 2 paper parcels. She told him she ran sheep and hay. He told her he was fixing a collapsed barn. She asked how the east side soil was doing, and he said it was thin but workable. And she told him where to find the nearest seasonal spring, which was not on his survey but was on public land and free to use. He thanked her for that. He had the kind of voice that thanked people like he meant it, which is rarer than it sounds, and it registered. They saw each other at Sunday service the following week. They talked again at the Mercantile the week after. By Christmas they were having supper at the Aldridge place on Fridays, which Silas permitted with the equanimity of a father who can see what is happening and has decided it is a good thing. Silas had liked Caleb from early on, in the careful, watchful way of a man who makes slow judgments and trusts them. He had noticed that Caleb listened when you talked, actually listened rather than waiting for his own turn, and that he did not fill silences with noise for the sake of filling them. He had noticed that Caleb never had an unkind word for anyone in the valley, which was unusual enough to be worth noting. He had noticed one other thing which he had never voiced to anyone, not even Nora. Caleb Doss moved through the world with a kind of awareness that went beyond the ordinary alertness of a frontier man. He noticed things. He noticed doorways and distances and where people were positioned in a room. Silas had seen that quality once before, in a man he had known in Missouri before the war, and that man had been someone it was useful to have on your side and wise not to stand across from. He never told Nora this. He figured she either already knew or would find out, and either way it was not his information to offer. By the following spring, Caleb was helping with the sheep shearing, unprompted, and Nora was helping him replant his kitchen garden after the late frost killed the first planting. Unprompted, and the town had quietly filed this under the heading of obvious outcomes and moved on to other topics. Silas Aldridge died in January of 1882. The pneumonia came on fast and moved faster. He was a tough man, but he was 61, and the territory's winters were not gentle, and by the 9th day he was gone. He died on a Sunday morning with Nora holding his hand and the preacher Grice sitting across the bed, and he died having kept every receipt and record and survey note and ledger entry from 18 years of operations in a tin-bound chest under the main room's floorboards, which was the kind of final gift a methodical man leaves without ever saying he is leaving it. Nora buried her father in the churchyard behind the chapel. Then she went home and spent 3 days going through the tin chest. She was not being morbid. She was being practical, which is the other word for the same thing. When you are 22 and suddenly in charge of a property with 3 artesian draws that a man named Harlan Voss had been trying to acquire for 2 years. Harlan Voss, Voss had come to Redstone Crossing in 1878 with a lawyer and 2 ledgers and the quiet, organized patience of a man who understood that the real frontier was not one with a gun. He was from the East, from old railroad money reinvested in land, and he had built the Crescent V Ranch into the valley's largest cattle operation inside of 3 years, through a combination of legitimate purchase, aggressive option contracts, and the kind of legal maneuvering that was not quite fraud but required a talented lawyer to confirm. He had the polished manners of a man who had learned early that being liked was more useful than being feared, and the colder eyes of a man who had also learned that being liked was a tool rather than a virtue. He had offered to buy Silas Aldridge's water rights claim twice. Silas had refused twice, politely and without malice, and Voss had accepted both refusals, politely and without malice. And the 2 of them had maintained a surface cordiality that fooled no one in the valley, but performed itself well enough for public consumption. The rest of the valley knew Voss's pattern, roughly, the way you know a neighbor's habits without ever sitting down and charting them out. He was careful with the people whose goodwill he needed. He paid his bills in Redstone Crossing promptly, the mercantile, the livery, the farrier. He made modest donations to the chapel fund. He did not make scenes or raise his voice in public, and on the 2 or 3 occasions when one of his hired men did, Voss appeared the following morning to make it right with whoever had been on the receiving end. He was, by any normal measure of community conduct, an acceptable neighbor. The valley understood that the acceptable neighbor and the man buying up draw water access one family at a time were the same man. But he had been careful enough and gradual enough that by the time a person had the full picture in their head, each individual piece of it looked reasonable. That is how it goes, usually. Not fire and menace, just patience and paper and a lawyer who knows which county offices to visit and when. After Silas died, Voss waited 7 weeks. Then he sent his accounts manager to see Nora. The accounts manager's name was Edson Crew. He was a pale, thin-necked man from Ohio who had come west for reasons he never explained, and had found his way into Voss's employ through a chain of connections that said something unflattering about the company he kept. He was not a stupid man. He was the particular kind of intelligent that substitutes calculation for judgment, and thinks it has made a good trade. Crew came to the Aldridge place on a Tuesday morning in late March with a document in a leather case and a pleasant smile that did not reach his eyes. The document claimed that Silas Aldridge had borrowed $800 from the Crescent V Grazing and Improvement Company in June of 1879, secured against the Western water rights claim. The document had a signature. The document had a notary stamp. The document said that with Mr. Aldridge now deceased, the loan had matured, and if the estate could not satisfy the balance by the 1st of November, the water rights claim would be surrendered as collateral. Nora read the document twice. She asked to keep a copy. Crew said he would need to take the original and that a copy could be arranged through the Crescent V's offices. He left smiling. She stood at the window and watched his horse move back down the lane toward the road. He had the easy, upright seat of a man who had delivered this kind of news before, and found it went smoothly when you dressed it correctly. The morning was already warm, the early spring light flat and yellow across the pasture, and the yard looked exactly as it always had, the water trough, the fence her father had mended 2 summers ago, the near draw running in its channel below the cottonwoods. Nothing in the view had changed. What had changed was the piece of paper that had just ridden away in a leather case, and the word forgery, running quiet and cold in the back of her mind. Not panicked, just settled there like a stone dropped in still water. She was not a woman given to long moments of standing and feeling. She went to the tin chest. Nora spent the next 3 days in her father's tin chest. There was no record of any loan from the Crescent V. Not in the operating ledger, not in the correspondence file, not in the bank book, not in any of the receipts her father had kept with the near-religious attention of a man who had been poor enough once to understand what paperwork was worth. Silas Aldridge had borrowed money twice in his 18 years in the valley. Once from the Santa Fe land office for the original survey and purchase, and once from the Cimarron Bank for a new shearing shed. Both fully repaid and documented in the ledger. There was no $800 loan from the Crescent V. The signature on the document was wrong in a way she could not have specified, but could feel in the way you feel when a familiar handwriting is not quite right, like a piece of music played a half-step off-key. She told Caleb that evening. Caleb asked to see the document. She told him Crew had taken it. He nodded once and said he would look into it. He spent 2 days at the county courthouse. He was, to anyone watching, a man with minor administrative business, the kind of thing anyone might have, asking about records in the same unhurried way he did everything. The county clerk, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Landers, who had worked the office for 9 years and remembered everything filed in it, answered his questions without suspicion because he asked them without urgency, which is the whole art of that kind of inquiry. What he found was this: the Crescent V had, in the previous 6 months, acquired water access rights from 2 other Valley families under debt settlement arrangements. Both families had left. Both arrangements had involved Crew, and a document the families had not previously seen. One of those families, the Okafor Welsh claim on the North Draw, had tried to dispute it and had found themselves facing a lawsuit from the Crescent V's lawyers before the dispute was 2 weeks old. They had sold for 20 cents on the dollar and moved to Albuquerque. The other family had not even tried to dispute it. He also found the filing record for the Aldridge water rights lien. The document had been filed at the county recorder's office in February of 1882, 1 month after Silas Aldridge had died. The document claimed a loan made in June of 1879. The filing stamp said February 1882. The man who supposedly signed it in June of 1879 had been in the ground since January of 1882. Caleb stood in the county recorder's office for a moment with that fact laid out in front of him. He had a particular way of receiving bad information, not reacting to it right away, just letting it settle, the way a man lets his eyes adjust to a dark room before he starts moving around in it. Then he wrote down the filing date and the document number, and thanked the clerk, and rode back to the Aldridge place. He told Nora what he had found. He told it to her plainly, without drama, the way he told her everything. The filing date, what it meant, the fact that her father had been dead for a month before the document was filed, the fact that a dead man cannot sign a loan agreement. He said the document is a forgery. The filing date proves it. They were sitting at the kitchen table when he said it, with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them. Outside, the first frogs of the season had started up in the draw, the sound carrying in the way it does on a still spring evening. He watched her take it in. She did not look surprised. Exactly. She looked the way a person looks when a thing they already suspected gets confirmed, a kind of grim settling, the slight release of having named the thing. She was quiet for a stretch that might have been 30 seconds or 2 minutes. Then she reached across the table and opened her father's ledger to the June 1879 pages, and ran her finger down the column a second time, not because she had missed anything, but because she needed to do it again with the courthouse information alongside it. The handwriting in the ledger was as familiar to her as her own. Her father had used the same pen grip his whole life, a slight leftward lean on the capital letters, consistent across 18 years of entries. The signature on Crew's document had not had that lean. She had noticed it the first time she read the document and had not been able to say why it was wrong. Now she could. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She said, "What do we do?" He said, "We go ahead with the wedding. We bring your father's ledger. When Voss's people show up, and they will show up because the date was published, and Voss is not a patient man when he thinks he sees an opening, we show the ledger alongside the county filing date in front of witnesses. We make it a public fact instead of a private accusation. A public fact is harder to bury than a private one," she said. "And if that's not enough," he looked at her with the particular stillness he had, and said, "I think it will be. I think there are things I know about how to manage a situation that I would prefer to never have to use again. and I think the ledger and the filing date will make that unnecessary." She understood what he meant, and did not ask him to explain further, because she was the kind of person who understood when a door was being held open rather than unlocked. On the morning of October 3rd, Caleb rose before the sun had cleared the mesa. He had told Nora he needed to ride to Cimarron and back. He had told her it was for some surveying equipment her father had left with a neighbor there for safekeeping. After the funeral, this was partly true. The surveying equipment was real. He would collect it. What he had not told her was that he had also arranged, weeks earlier, to collect a second thing from that same neighbor. His mother's ring. It was a plain silver band, worn smooth. He had carried it for 11 years through everything that had happened to him. He had never had a reason to use it, until now. He wanted Nora to be surprised. He was gone before first light and back by 9:30. He saw the chapel from the ridgeline. He saw that the crowd was in the road instead of inside, which was wrong for 10 o'clock. He saw the 4 men from the Crescent V. He saw the badge, Pickett, Walt Pickett, the county sheriff who had been receiving a quiet monthly payment from the Crescent V for the last 2 years, a fact the valley knew and ignored in the way that small places ignore uncomfortable facts about the men who carry their authority. And he saw Nora. She was on the chapel steps, on the 3rd step down from the door, being held by 2 men, one on each arm, fighting them with a quiet ferocity that was entirely her and entirely not working, because she was smaller than both of them, and they knew it, and she knew it, and neither fact was going to change in the next 30 seconds. Her white dress had torn at the shoulder seam. Her dark hair had come loose on one side. She was not screaming anymore. She had said what she wanted to say, and they had not listened, and now she was conserving herself, staying precise, looking for the moment. Pickett was reading from the lien document. Debt, collateral, legal authority. The words of a man performing a script he had memorized. Caleb stopped his horse. He sat still for exactly as long as he needed to. He filed every position the way he had not needed to in 14 months. 4 men. Pickett. The crowd, 20-odd souls in Sunday clothes, frozen in the road. Good people, most of them, but frozen because sometimes the crowd just needs someone to move first. The angle of the road to the chapel. The gap between the wagon and the gate. The weight of the ring in his pocket. Then the man near the wagon looked up toward the ridge. The man's name was Felix Guard. He was 43 years old, born in Sonora, and he had spent the better part of his adult life as what the newspapers called a hired hard case, which was a polite way of saying he did whatever unpleasant things needed doing for whoever was paying. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He had lines he would not cross, though the lines had shifted over the years in the way lines do when you spend enough time around people who don't have them. He had ended up in Voss's employ 6 months earlier, which was a step down from some of his earlier work, and a step up from others. 3 years ago, Felix had been part of a crew hired to pressure a group of homesteaders near the Canadian River in the Northeast Territory. The job had gone bad in the way those jobs sometimes went. One of the other men on the crew had decided to escalate past what had been agreed. And by the time it was over, 3 people were injured, and the local marshal was 2 hours away, and the entire crew was in the middle of a situation that was going to end in either a shooting or a hanging. Felix had been positioned near a water tank on the north side of the homestead when the man in the flat-brimmed hat stepped out of a barn and looked at him. The man had had a clear angle. It was not a complicated shot. Felix had known it, and the man had known it. Instead, the man had said, "You don't have to die for someone else's money. Walk away from this job, walk away from these people, and don't draw for hire again." And Felix had made the calculation of a man who has been offered a clean exit from a situation that has no clean exits. And he had walked. He had not stopped thinking about it. He looked at the flat-brimmed hat on the ridge and the face under it, and he felt 2 things in sequence. The first was the cold recognition of a man who has been found by something he thought he had left behind. The second was the particular sensation, unfamiliar, uncomfortable, undeniable, of a debt come due in a way that also happened to be an opportunity. Down in the yard, the situation had the particular stillness of something that has not yet decided which way it will go. Pickett had stopped reading from the document and was watching the ridge. One of the men near the chapel steps had moved slightly. Not a draw. Not yet, but a repositioning of weight that said his hands were thinking about it. The other three were watching Pickett for a signal, and Pickett was watching the man on the ridge. And none of them were moving because none of them had been told to move. The crowd in the road was still. 20 people or thereabouts, in their Sunday clothes, and not one of them was speaking. Hector Beaumont had his hat in both hands. Turning it, 2 women near the mercantile side of the road had drawn close together. A boy of maybe 10, there with his father, had worked his way slightly behind the nearest adult in a manner he probably did not notice he was doing. Nora had gone still, too. She had stopped fighting, not because she had given up, but because she had spotted the horse on the ridge and recognized the hat, and because fighting blindly in the next 30 seconds might produce exactly the kind of noise that landed wrong. She kept her arms where they were, one man gripping each, and she watched the ridge, and she waited. Caleb walked his horse down the ridge at a measured pace, not slow exactly, but unhurried in the way that had nothing to do with casualness. The crowd parted a little without being asked, not dramatically, just the natural give of people who sense something moving through them with a kind of weight. He stopped his horse at the edge of the yard, 12 feet from Pickett. "Mr. Doss," Pickett said with the reflexive authority of a man who has learned that the voice of authority buys you a second before you have to figure out what to do with it. "You'll want to stay back. This is a legal proceeding. There's an outstanding debt against the Aldridge water rights claim, and until it's—" "May I see that paper?" Caleb said. Not loud, not aggressive. Just the question, asked in the tone of a man who expects to get what he's asking for. Pickett blinked. He had expected something different. Men like Caleb Doss, quiet ranchers who fixed barns and split oats at the mercantile, did not generally respond to ambush situations with a polite request for documentation. He had not built a procedure for this. "This document is illegal. I understand that," Caleb said. "I'd like to see it. I have something to compare it to." He reached into his coat and produced Silas Aldridge's private operating ledger. He held it up so the crowd could see it. "This is Mr. Aldridge's ledger. Every loan, every payment, every transaction on the Aldridge property for the last 18 years. I spent 2 days going through it." There was a quality to the silence that happens when a crowd of people collectively starts to understand what they are watching. It is not loud. It just changes the texture of the air. Pickett looked at the 2 men flanking him. He looked at Nora, who had stopped fighting and was watching Caleb with the expression of a woman who is measuring something very carefully. He looked back at Caleb. Then he walked forward 2 steps and held out the document. Caleb took it. He read it without any visible change in his face. He found the date on the document, June 1879. He found the county filing stamp on the reverse, February 1882. He found the page he had marked in the ledger, Silas Aldridge's careful hand recording every loan transaction in the operating years the lien claimed to cover. No Crescent V, no $800, no June 1879. He turned toward the chapel steps, toward the Reverend, who was standing in a doorway with the expression of a man who wished he were somewhere that did not require any of the virtues he had been preaching about. "Reverend Grice," Caleb said, "when did Silas Aldridge die?" Grice swallowed. "January," he said. "January the 14th. This year, yes." Caleb held up the document so the crowd could see the stamp on the back. "This lien was filed in February of 1882, 1 month after Mr. Aldridge died." He held up the ledger. The document claims he signed a loan agreement in June of 1879. He was alive in June of 1879. He was in the ground in February of 1882 when this was filed. He paused, for exactly as long as the pause needed to be. The signature is a forgery. The loan was fabricated. This debt doesn't exist, and these men need to release her right now." The crowd made a sound that was not quite anything. Not outrage, not applause, just the audible exhale of 20 people understanding the same thing at once. Hector Beaumont from the Mercantile, who was standing near the back of the road, said something under his breath that nobody exactly heard. Old Mrs. Portier, who had been at every significant event in Redstone Crossing for 20 years, made a sound that was distinctly not approval toward the sheriff's direction. The two ranch hands who had stood by and done nothing were now looking at the ground. The thing about a crowd in a moment like that is that it does not need to act to matter. What it needs to do is be there, and know the same thing, and have that knowing be visible on 20 faces at once. The two men still holding Nora's arms could feel it, the change in the weight of the yard, the way it tilted. One of them shifted his grip without quite meaning to. The other one let his eyes move to Pickett, then to Voss's direction, then away, the small, restless inventory of a man who is beginning to do the arithmetic of consequences and not liking where it comes out. Reverend Grice was still standing in the chapel doorway. He had the filing documents claim and the ledger's absence of any such loan and the exact date of Silas Aldridge's death, all sitting together in his head now, and his expression had moved past discomfort into something closer to shame, though a careful observer might have noted it was the shame of a man who should have spoken earlier and was only now considering what that would have cost him. Pickett said, "Now hold on that will be enough, Walt." The voice came from the road behind the crowd. Everyone turned. Harlan Voss rode in alone. He had left his second pair of men back along the Cimarron Road when the rider had told him there might be a complication. And he had come forward himself because Voss was the kind of man who dealt with complications personally rather than delegating the assessment of them. He was 51, broad through the shoulders, with a close-trimmed gray beard and the quality of stillness that belongs to men who are accustomed to rooms paying attention to them when they enter. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Pickett. He looked at the four men and at Nora between two of them, and at the document in Caleb's hand. And then he looked at Caleb. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in it shifted, the way a man's expression shifts when he is doing a rapid recalculation of a situation, and the recalculation is coming out differently than the original math. 3 years ago, a St. Louis newspaper had run a story about an incident near the Canadian River. A crew of hired men had been systematically disarmed by a single individual over the course of one afternoon without a shot being fired. The reporter had called the man the patient gunman. The story had run with a sketch that captured the hat and the stillness and the general shape of a man who moved through a situation with the specific unhurried economy of someone who has stopped being afraid of things. Voss had read that story. He had kept it, because Voss kept things that might become useful. He had not expected to need it in Redstone Crossing. "Mr. Doss?" he said. "Mr. Voss," Caleb said. The morning held. "Now, partner, here's the thing you need to understand about this standoff, because it looks like one kind of situation and is actually a different kind entirely. On one side of that yard, Voss, 4 hired men, a compromised sheriff. On the other side, Caleb Doss with a ledger, a filing date, and no drawn weapon. The arithmetic of it does not favor Caleb, unless you're calculating the other arithmetic. The one that says Voss is a businessman, not a killer, and his whole operation in this valley, his permits, his relationships with the county commissioner, his standing before the circuit judge in Santa Rosa, his ability to do business in this county for the next 10 years, depends on him not being the man who publicly drags a bride off chapel steps in front of 20 witnesses, and then shoots the groom when he points out the forgery. That arithmetic was running in Voss's head, and it was running fast, and it was not coming out in favor of the guns. Voss said, "You're claiming the lien is fraudulent?" Caleb said, "I'm not claiming it. I'm showing it the county recorder's stamp is on the back. February 1882. Mr. Aldridge died in January 1882. Those dates don't move. I was not aware, Voss said with a careful flatness, of the specific mechanism by which that document was prepared. Caleb looked at him for a moment. I believe that, he said, and he said it in the particular tone that meant what it said. The acknowledgement that Crew might have executed the forgery below Voss's direct instruction, which was a legal distinction that mattered, and which Caleb was deliberately giving Voss room to claim. Voss understood what was being offered. He was not a man who failed to recognize a clean exit when one was presented. One of the men by the chapel steps shifted his weight. His hand moved toward his belt. Not quite a draw, but the beginning of an intention. Don't. Felix Guard said it from 6 feet away, off to the left, having moved during the conversation in a way that nobody had tracked because everyone's attention was on Caleb and Voss. He was not reaching for his own gun. He was just standing there, in range, with an expression that did not need any elaboration. The man looked at Felix. Then he looked at Voss. Voss looked at Felix. Something passed between their eyes. Not quite recognition, but the assessment of a man looking at another man who is no longer positioned where he is supposed to be. Felix, he said carefully, what exactly are you doing? Settling something, Felix said. That's all. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the thin-necked man sitting a horse behind the rest of the group. Edson Crew, who had ridden out with Voss's second party and was now trying very hard to be invisible, which is not a thing a thin-necked man on a horse in a churchyard is capable of achieving when a very particular quality of attention has just been turned in his direction. Crew looked at the ground. That was the conversation. It lasted half a second and said everything. Voss had built his operation in this valley with patience and legal instruments, and the long view of a man who understood that the frontier was becoming a place with courts and newspapers and territorial marshals with memories. He had not, to his knowledge, authorized a forgery. He had authorized Crew to find a way to acquire the water claim by available means, and Crew had interpreted that more liberally than intended. And now Voss was standing in the churchyard of Redstone Crossing with 20 witnesses watching him, and a man he recognized from a newspaper sketch standing 12 feet away holding a ledger, and a member of his own crew having quietly switched sides. The arithmetic was not complicated. Gentlemen, Voss said. He said it to his men in a voice that had gotten quiet and precise in the way of a man communicating that the performance is over. Stand down. Release the lady. Nobody moved for one long breath. Then the 2 men holding Nora's arms let go. She stepped clear of them immediately, without stumbling, without running, just one deliberate step to the side, and then she was standing in the yard with her back straight and her chin level and her dark eyes on Voss, and she did not look like a woman who had just been frightened. She looked like a woman who had been interrupted in something important, and was waiting for the interruption to conclude. Voss reached into his breast pocket. He produced a small leather notebook and a pen. He tore a page, uncapped the pen, and stood in the dirt yard of the Redstone Crossing chapel, and wrote 6 lines in a clear, legible hand. The withdrawal of the Crescent V lien. His signature. The date. He held it out in Caleb's direction. Caleb took it. Read it. Handed it to Nora. Nora read every word. Folded it twice with the particular care of a woman folding a deed. Placed it inside her dress. Looked at Voss. She said, without heat, without theater, "Thank you." Voss held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned his horse. His men fell in behind him. Pickett, after a pause that communicated his exact understanding of how his situation had changed, turned and followed. Felix Guard remained standing in the yard. The crowd stayed where it was for a moment. The way crowds do after something they were expecting to be dramatic, resolved itself quietly, trying to determine whether it was over or whether there was more. Then Hector Beaumont from the Mercantile walked forward into the yard, and he put his hand briefly on Nora's shoulder without saying anything. And that small action broke the freeze. Other people began to move. Someone near the chapel door started talking. The two ranch hands who had stood by and done nothing were now several paces apart, trying to look like they had been doing something useful the whole time. Reverend Grice stepped down from the chapel threshold and stood in the yard with an expression of a man who has a great deal to think about in his next sermon. The morning moved forward into the particular territory that comes after a crisis, when the crisis did not become what it threatened to be. Now, for what happened next, in the days and weeks following that October morning. Edson Crew was arrested 11 days later when the circuit judge arrived in Santa Rosa for the fall session. Nora had filed a formal complaint with the county commissioner's office the following week, presenting the operating ledger and the county filing stamp, and a sworn statement from Reverend Grice about the date of Silas Aldridge's death. Crew, faced with the specific and demonstrable mechanics of his own forgery, cooperated with the court in the direct and comprehensive way that men in his position generally cooperate when the alternative is a federal penitentiary. He confirmed that Voss had instructed him to find a way to acquire the water rights claim by available means, and that he had extended that instruction beyond what had been authorized. The line between Crew's individual criminality and Voss's culpability was narrow enough that Voss's lawyer could argue it, and did. Successfully. Voss was not charged. He did not need to be. The public record of the lien withdrawal was already filed. The water rights claim was confirmed in the Aldridge estate without encumbrance. Voss's practical position in the valley had changed in the hardest possible way. Publicly, before witnesses, in a county where word travels in the way word always travels in small places, which is to say everywhere by nightfall. He left Redstone Crossing by the end of 1884. He sold the Crescent V to a consortium from Denver at something below what he had paid to build it, which was the cost of the public record he had left behind him. His kind always moves on eventually when a territory stops being easy and starts being the kind of place with people who read filing dates. There is always another valley somewhere that hasn't learned to read them yet. That is not a comforting thought, partner, but it is an honest one. Walt Pickett was removed as sheriff by the county commissioner in December, following formal complaints from 3 valley families. The commissioner's letter of removal was notably terse. 2 sentences, no ceremony, which in a county that ran to flowery official language was its own kind of statement. Pickett spent a few months trying to find work in the area, failed to find any, and drifted south toward Albuquerque. Nobody in Redstone Crossing heard from him again, and nobody went looking. Felix Guard stayed. He had not asked for anything. After Voss's men rode out that morning, he remained in the churchyard, standing near the gate without particular purpose, until Caleb walked over to him. They talked for a few minutes, low voices, nobody close enough to hear. After that, Felix unsaddled his horse and put it in the Aldridge paddock, and by nightfall he was in the guest room of what was now the Doss Ranch, and the following Monday he was working. He was a competent man and a steady one, and he had the particular quality of silence that belongs to people who are trying to become something, which is different from the silence of people who are hiding something, though from the outside they can look the same. He worked at the Doss property for 6 years. He saved what he earned. He did not talk about his past, which suited his employers perfectly well, since they were not talking about theirs either. In 1888 he bought a small holding north of Cimarron and moved there. He ran cattle, not many, and raised a kitchen garden and paid his debts on time, and did not draw for hire. Whether he ever fully made peace with the thing he had been before is a question that belongs to him and not to this story. But he tried, and the trying was genuine, and that is most of what the word redemption actually means. The wedding itself happened that same afternoon of October 3rd. Reverend Grice, who had spent the intervening hours in a private crisis about the person he had been that morning versus the person his sermons claimed him to be, came out of it with a kind of raw feeling that made his delivery of the ceremony considerably less polished and considerably more real than usual. Nora's cousins from Cimarron had stayed. One of them had a traveling kit with needle and thread, and had spent 20 minutes on the torn shoulder seam of the dress, and it would not have passed inspection in a seamstress's shop, but it held, and Nora wore it without complaint. The ceremony was in the late afternoon, when the clouds that had been building since noon finally turned the light from gold to silver, and the chapel's oil lamps came on and made the interior warm against the early October dark, coming in through the windows. The cottonwoods along the Pecos were showing gold, and the wind had come up, and inside the chapel it smelled of lamp oil and beeswax, and the particular smell of a place where a community has been gathering itself for years. Grice kept the ceremony honest and brief, which is the best kind. He spoke about two people choosing each other in a country where choosing was not always easy. He said something about water in the dry land, which was probably intended metaphorically and landed differently than he planned, and a few people in the pews laughed, and then he laughed too, and the ceremony was better for it. When he got to the rings, Caleb reached into his coat pocket, not for the surveying instruments which he had left with the horse, and which would keep, for the ring, the plain silver band, worn smooth, that had been in his pocket all morning through everything that had happened, through the ride down the ridge and the yard and the forgery and Voss and Felix, and the withdrawal of the lien, sitting quiet in its place the whole time. Waiting, he held it up for a moment in the lamplight. Nora looked at it. He placed it on her finger. She looked at it for a long moment. She looked at him. She said quietly, so only he could fully hear it, "Where did that come from?" He said, "It was my mother's. I rode to Cimarron this morning to get it, from the neighbor who was keeping it." She was quiet for a beat. Outside, the wind moved the cottonwoods. She said, "You could have told me." He said, "Wouldn't have been a surprise." She looked at the ring. She looked at the man in front of her, the man she had shared rolled oats with at the Mercantile 2 years ago, the man who had helped shear her father's sheep without being asked, the man who carried his past in a coat pocket without ever asking her to carry it with him. She knew what he was. She had known for a while in the way that people who are paying attention always know. She had chosen him anyway. She had chosen him because of the man the previous version of him had decided to become. He said, "I know what I used to be. I know what I'm not anymore. None of that matters as much as what I am now, which is yours." She said, "I know who you are, Caleb." He said, "I know you do." Grice, who had overheard enough to understand that something more important than the ceremony itself was happening, pronounced them married in a voice that was notably less shaky than the rest of his afternoon had been. The town came forward. There was modest celebration. A fiddle materialized from somewhere, and cold cider, and the comfortable noise of a community that is happy for real reasons rather than performed ones. Nora danced with her cousins, and her dress held together through all of it. Hector Beaumont had produced 2 bottles of something from his store's back shelf that he claimed was for medicinal purposes only, and nobody challenged this. Reverend Grice, in a marked departure from his usual after-ceremony solemnity, had 2 small glasses, and was eventually seen laughing at something one of Nora's cousins said. Caleb stood to one side for most of the early evening with the particular quietness of a man who is content in a way he had mostly stopped expecting to be. He watched Nora move through the celebration, the way she talked to people, the way she was entirely herself and entirely at ease in the company of people who had known her all her life. He thought about the ring on her finger, the one that had been in his pocket through everything, and about the 12 miles north and 12 miles back he had ridden that morning with it, through a canyon and a creek crossing, and one long dry stretch under the early autumn sky, just to make sure it was there for this exact moment. He thought it had been worth the ride. Felix Guard stood near the back of the yard. He did not join the celebration, but he also did not leave, and that distinction mattered to the small number of people paying attention to it. At one point Nora walked over to him, briefly, and said something quiet. He nodded once. She went back to her cousins. Whatever was said in that exchange remained between the two of them, But Felix's expression afterward was noticeably different from what it had been when the morning started. Now, here's the thing I keep coming back to, partner. Every time I sit with this story and try to figure out what it's actually about, because the temptation with a story like this is to make it about justice, or about the right man having the right skills at the right time, or about the frontier sorting itself out the way people like to think it did. And maybe it's some of those things. But what I keep coming back to is that Caleb Doss chose not to draw. At every point in that morning, on the ridge, in the yard, when the man shifted his weight toward his belt, when Voss arrived with his quiet authority, Caleb had options that were faster and more decisive and would have made the story more dramatic. He didn't take them, not because he was afraid to. He hadn't been afraid of that kind of thing for a long time. He didn't take them because he had a better tool. The better tool was a filing date. It was a ledger. It was 20 people standing in a dirt road who needed someone to show them what the truth was so they could decide what to do with it. That is not a glamorous weapon. It doesn't make a good sketch for a newspaper story about the patient gunman. But it is the weapon that did not require anyone to die, and did not require Caleb to become again the thing he had worked hard to stop being, and did not burn down the life he was trying to build. The water rights claim stayed with the Doss family for the next 31 years. They ran sheep and hay, and in the dry years, Caleb managed the water access with the same fairness Silas Aldridge had. And the valley remembered it. The 3 artesian draws never ran dry. Nora Doss outlived her husband by 9 years. She continued to run the property after his death in 1921, because she was, and always had been, the kind of woman who did not stop working because circumstances had changed. She was buried next to him and her father in the churchyard behind the chapel in Redstone Crossing. In the spring of 1930, she was buried wearing the ring. Here is what I want you to take away from this, partner. Not the guns, and not the standoff, and not even the forged signature, though all of those are part of it. What I want you to take away is the ride that morning. Caleb Doss rose before dawn and rode 12 miles north and 12 miles back to retrieve a ring he had been carrying for 11 years, through everything that had happened to him, just to place it on the right finger at the right time and see the surprise on her face. He carried it through an ambush. He carried it through a forgery and a standoff, and a cattle baron and a man he'd once spared who turned out to matter more than anything else in the yard that morning. He carried it through all of it, and it sat quiet in his pocket the whole time, and when the moment came, he produced it in the lamplight, and it was perfect. That's the story of Caleb Doss, a man who carried quiet things and knew exactly when to bring them out. Subscribe if you're still here, partner, and leave me that one thing, the thing you carried quietly for a long time before anyone found out you were carrying it. I want to hear it. See you at the next fire.